The wooden door exploded inward with a thunderous crack, splinters flying across the dim interior like deadly rain. Samuel's bare chest heaved as he rolled off the narrow bed, his calloused hands instinctively reaching for the Colt revolver hanging from the leather holster on the chair. But before his fingers could close around the grip, the barrel of a Springfield rifle pressed cold against his temple. "Don't even think about it, deserter." The voice belonged to Sergeant Martinez, a weathered Apache scout whose face bore the traditional scars of his people alongside the blue uniform of the United States Army. Behind him, 3 more soldiers crowded into the one-room cabin, their eyes adjusting to the darkness that had concealed Samuel's hideout for the past 6 months. Elena gasped from beneath the rough wool blanket, her dark hair spilling across the pillow as she pressed herself against the log wall. Her brown eyes, wide with terror, darted between Samuel and the intruders. The delicate silk chemise she wore seemed absurdly out of place in this crude mountain refuge, a reminder of the world she belonged to and the one Samuel had abandoned. "Elena Vasquez," Martinez said, recognition flickering across his weathered features. "Don Ramon's daughter. Well, well. This complicates things considerably." Samuel's jaw tightened. The October wind whistled through the broken doorframe, carrying the scent of pine and the distant promise of snow. Outside, he could hear the snorting of horses and the jangle of spurs against stirrups. How many had they brought? How long had they been watching? "Get dressed," Martinez ordered Elena, though his eyes remained fixed on Samuel. "Both of you." Slowly. Elena's hands trembled as she reached for her riding dress, the practical brown wool that had allowed her to make these secret journeys to the mountain cabin without arousing suspicion. Samuel pulled on his worn denim pants, his mind racing through possibilities of escape. The back window was too small, and the soldiers had positioned themselves strategically. Professional. These weren't regular cavalry stumbling through the wilderness. They'd planned this carefully. "Samuel Morrison," Martinez continued, consulting a folded paper from his breast pocket. "Formerly Private First Class, 3rd Regiment, Arizona Volunteers. Charged with desertion in the face of the enemy, failure to obey direct orders, and—" He paused, his black eyes hardening. "Treason against the United States government." Elena's sharp intake of breath cut through the cabin's oppressive silence. Samuel saw her staring at him, the color draining from her olive-toned face. In her eyes, he watched 6 months of careful deception crumble like sand in the desert wind. "That's not possible," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Samuel's a hunter. He works for the mining company. He's never—" "Ma'am," Martinez interrupted gently, "this man deserted his unit during the attack on Cibecue Creek. Left his fellow soldiers to die while he ran into these mountains like a coward." Samuel's hands clenched into fists, but the rifle barrel pressed harder against his skull. "You don't know what you're talking about," he growled. "I saw what Colonel Henderson ordered us to do. Innocent women and children. Old men who could barely walk. That wasn't war, it was murder." "Murder?" One of the younger soldiers, a freckled kid who couldn't have been more than 19, spat on the cabin floor. "My brother died at Cibecue because you weren't there to cover his position. You talk about innocence, but Jimmy Martinez was innocent too." The family name hung heavy in the air. Samuel's eyes found Sergeant Martinez again, understanding dawning. "Your brother?" Martinez nodded slowly. "My younger brother. Half Apache, half Mexican, like me. But he wore the blue uniform proudly. Believed in something bigger than himself. Unlike some." Elena stood carefully, her dress now properly arranged but her face pale as morning frost. "I don't understand any of this." "Samuel, tell them they're wrong. Tell them you're not this person they're describing." Samuel met her gaze, seeing the desperate hope there, the need for him to provide some explanation that would make sense of this nightmare. But the truth sat between them like a loaded weapon, and he was tired of running from it. "I can't," he said quietly. "Because they're right." The words hit Elena like physical blows. She stumbled backward, her hand finding the rough log wall for support. "You lied to me. About everything. Your name, your past, who you are. Not everything, Samuel said urgently. What we have, what I feel for you, that's real. It's the only real thing I've had in 2 years. Martinez gestured to his men. Chain him. We need to move before the weather turns. As iron shackles closed around Samuel's wrists, Elena's composure finally shattered. My father supports the territorial government. He contributes to the military campaigns. If anyone discovers I was here, with you, it will destroy our family's reputation. Everything my father has worked for. Elena, listen to me, Samuel said as the soldiers prepared to drag him from the cabin. What happened at Sibicu, what I saw there, it changes everything. Your father, the other ranchers, they don't know the truth about these campaigns. They think they're supporting legitimate military operations, but Henderson and his men are using the Apache conflicts to cover up something much worse. Martinez struck Samuel across the face with the back of his gloved hand. Enough lies, deserter. Save your stories for the court-martial. But Samuel pressed on, blood trickling from his split lip. Elena, there are documents. Hidden in the false bottom of that chest. Maps, orders, correspondence. Look at them. See what your father's money is really funding. Elena stared at the wooden chest in the corner, the one Samuel had always kept locked. What kind of documents? Proof that Colonel Henderson has been selling military weapons to Mexican revolutionaries. Using Apache raids as cover to move shipments across the border. The attack on Sibicu wasn't about subduing hostile Indians. It was about eliminating witnesses who'd seen the gun runners. Martinez's rifle swung toward Samuel's chest. One more word and I'll shoot you where you stand. The army wants you alive, but dead works just as well. As the soldiers forced Samuel toward the destroyed doorway, he managed one last look at Elena. She stood motionless in the center of the cabin, her dark eyes reflecting the dying embers in the fireplace. Beautiful and lost, caught between the world she'd known and the terrible truths he'd just revealed. The chest, Elena, he called out as they dragged him into the gray morning light. Look in the chest. The mountains of the Arizona Territory stretched endlessly around them, their peaks shrouded in clouds that promised the season's first snow. Samuel's breath misted in the cold air as Martinez tied him to the saddle of a bay gelding. The other soldiers mounted their horses with practiced efficiency, their faces grim beneath the brims of their campaign hats. Sergeant Martinez, Elena appeared in the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself against the chill. What will happen to him? Martinez paused in checking his horse's girth. Court-martial at Fort Apache. If he's lucky, life imprisonment. More likely. He shrugged. Desertion in time of war carries the death penalty, ma'am. Elena's face went ashen, but she said nothing more. Samuel twisted in his saddle, desperate to see her one final time, to somehow communicate the depth of his regret and the sincerity of his warnings. But she had already stepped back into the shadows of the cabin, leaving him with nothing but the bitter taste of blood and the weight of chains. As the small column wound its way down the treacherous mountain path, Samuel's mind raced through the events that had led him to this moment. The massacre at Sibicu Creek. His discovery of Henderson's gun-running operation. His desperate flight into the mountains. And Elena, beautiful Elena, who had brought light into his dark exile and now faced ruin because of their forbidden love. Behind them, smoke began to rise from the cabin's chimney. Elena was still there, still alive, still free. But for how long? If Henderson discovered what Samuel had told her, if the colonel suspected she might examine those hidden documents, her life would be worth nothing. Samuel pulled against his bonds, testing their strength. Martinez noticed the movement and urged his horse closer. Don't try anything foolish, Morrison. These mountains are full of dangers worse than military justice. Apache war parties, Mexican bandits, territorial marshals who shoot first and ask questions later. Your only chance of seeing another Christmas is to cooperate. But Samuel wasn't thinking about Christmas or his own survival. He was thinking about Elena, alone in that cabin with damning evidence of high-level corruption and treason. He was thinking about Colonel Henderson's ruthless efficiency in eliminating problems. He was thinking about the innocent woman he loved, and the terrible danger he'd placed her in by revealing the truth. The wind picked up, howling through the pine trees like the voices of the dead. Snow began to fall in earnest now, large flakes that would soon cover their tracks and hide their passage. But it would also hide other movements in these mountains. Other men with their own agendas and their own willingness to kill. Samuel closed his eyes and prayed to whatever gods might still listen to deserters and traitors. Not for himself, but for Elena. Let her be smart enough to flee. Let her be strong enough to survive what was coming. Because if Colonel Henderson had indeed discovered their connection, if he knew about the documents hidden in that cabin, then Elena Vasquez was already living on borrowed time. And Samuel, chained to a saddle and heading for military justice, was powerless to save her. The silence inside the cabin felt heavier than the mountain snow now blanketing the Arizona peaks. Elena stood frozen beside the wooden chest, Samuel's words echoing in her mind like gunshots in a canyon. Her fingers trembled as they traced the iron lock that had always seemed so insignificant before, just another piece of a hunter's simple furnishings. Documents. Maps. Correspondence. Proof of treason. The fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls. Elena's breathing came in short, sharp bursts that misted in the increasingly cold air seeping through the shattered door. She could still smell Samuel's presence here, the familiar scent of leather and wood smoke that had drawn her to these secret meetings for 6 months. 6 months of lies. Her hands shook as she examined the chest more carefully. The bottom seemed thicker than it should be, and when she pressed along the edges, she felt a slight give in the wood. A hidden compartment. Just as Samuel had said. The brass key hung from a leather cord behind the fireplace, exactly where Samuel had always kept his few precious possessions. Elena's conscience warred with her curiosity as she fitted the key into the lock. Opening this chest would make her complicit in whatever Samuel had discovered. But not opening it would leave her forever wondering if the man she'd loved had been telling the truth in those final desperate moments. The lid creaked open, revealing folded blankets, ammunition, and basic supplies. But when Elena pressed the false bottom, it shifted slightly. Her heart hammering against her ribs, she pried up the wooden panel. Beneath lay a leather portfolio thick with papers. The first document made her blood run cold. Official military letterhead bearing Colonel Henderson's signature, dated 3 months earlier. Orders for a weapons transfer to Mexican contacts at the Sonoran border. Not Apache suppression supplies, as her father believed his donation supported, but rifles and ammunition bound for revolutionary forces south of the Rio Grande. Elena's hands shook as she read letter after letter, each one more damning than the last. Henderson had been systematically using territorial military funds and private donations from wealthy ranchers like her father to purchase weapons. The guns were then sold to Mexican revolutionaries at enormous profit, with Apache raids serving as convenient cover for the smuggling operations. But the most chilling document was a telegram dated just 2 weeks ago. Witness situation critical. Stop Morrison knows too much. Stop eliminate all evidence. Stop Vasquez daughter potential problem. Stop handle discreetly. Stop. Elena's vision blurred as the implications crashed over her like a flash flood in the desert. Colonel Henderson knew about her relationship with Samuel. Knew she posed a threat to his operation. And the word eliminate left no room for misinterpretation. She was a dead woman. Outside, the wind howled through the pines with renewed fury, and Elena realized the storm was intensifying far beyond normal autumn weather. The snow was falling so heavily now that visibility beyond the cabin had dropped to mere yards. She was trapped here, alone, with evidence that powerful men would kill to suppress. Hoofbeats. Elena's breath caught in her throat as the sound of approaching horses cut through the storm's roar. Multiple riders, moving carefully up the mountain path despite the treacherous conditions. She quickly gathered the documents, her mind racing through options. The back window was too small for escape, and the terrain behind the cabin dropped away in a sheer cliff face. The approaching riders would see any attempt to flee long before she could reach cover. She stuffed the papers into her riding coat and moved to the shattered front door, peering through the gaps in the splintered wood. Through the swirling snow, she could make out the shapes of 5 horsemen, their faces obscured by pulled-up bandanas and the brims of their hats. But something about their posture, their coordinated movement, suggested military training. Henderson's men. Elena's fingers found the handle of Samuel's spare revolver, still hanging from its holster on the chair. The weight felt alien and terrifying in her hands, but she checked the cylinder as she'd seen her father do countless times. Fully loaded. The lead rider dismounted 20 yards from the cabin, his movements deliberate and cautious. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of command despite being muffled by wind and snow. "Miss Vasquez, we know you're in there. Colonel Henderson sent us to ensure your safe passage home. These mountains are dangerous in weather like this." Elena pressed herself against the wall beside the door, the revolver clutched against her chest. Everything about the man's tone suggested courtesy, but the timing of their arrival just hours after Samuel's capture seemed far too convenient to be coincidental. "I appreciate the concern," she called out, trying to keep her voice steady, "but I'm quite safe here until the storm passes." "I'm afraid that's not possible, miss. Your father is worried sick. He sent word to Fort Apache requesting military assistance in locating you." A lie. Elena was certain of it. Don Ramon expected her to visit her aunt in Tucson for several more days. He wouldn't begin worrying about her whereabouts for at least another week. The documents crinkled inside her coat as she shifted position. If these were Henderson's men, they'd search the cabin thoroughly once they realized she'd found Samuel's evidence. Her only chance was to somehow get word to the authorities in Phoenix or Tucson, but that meant surviving the next few minutes. "Miss Vasquez," the voice called again, closer now. "We're coming in to get you. The temperature's dropping fast, and this storm's getting worse. We need to move now if we're going to reach the fort before nightfall." Elena heard boots crunching through snow, multiple sets of feet approaching the cabin from different directions. They were surrounding the building. Professional. Methodical. These weren't territorial militiamen or concerned ranchers. These were soldiers following orders. The first man appeared in the doorway, his face partially visible beneath his hat brim. Elena recognized him immediately, Captain Morrison, Henderson's adjutant. A thin, nervous man with pale eyes and a reputation for absolute loyalty to his commanding officer. "There you are," Morrison said, his relief seeming genuine. "We've been searching for hours. Come along now, we need to get you to safety." Elena kept the revolver hidden behind her back, the metal grip slick with perspiration despite the cold. "How did you know to look for me here?" Morrison stepped into the cabin, his eyes quickly scanning the interior. The overturned furniture and scattered belongings from the morning's arrest were still exactly as the Apache scouts had left them. "Your horse was found wandering near the base of the mountain. We followed the trail up." Another lie. Elena's mare was safely stabled in a hidden corral half a mile down the mountain, exactly where she always left her during these visits. These men had known exactly where to find her. "Where's Samuel?" she asked, testing her suspicions. Morrison's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "The deserter? He's being transported to Fort Apache for trial. You're fortunate we arrived when we did, Miss Vasquez. Men like Morrison are dangerous, unpredictable. Who knows what he might have done to you if we hadn't intervened." Elena noticed how Morrison referred to Samuel by his surname, despite sharing the same name himself. Professional distance. Military protocol. But his knowledge of Samuel's location confirmed her worst fears about this rescue. "I'd like to gather my things before we leave," Elena said, moving slowly toward the wooden chest. "I'm afraid there's no time," Morrison replied, stepping between her and the furniture. "The storm's intensifying, and we have a long ride ahead. Whatever you need can be replaced." Elena's pulse quickened. Morrison was specifically preventing her from approaching the chest where the documents had been hidden. He knew what she might have found there. "Captain Morrison," she said carefully, "I wonder if you might tell me why Colonel Henderson is so concerned about my welfare? I'm just a rancher's daughter. Surely there are more pressing military matters requiring attention." Morrison's pale eyes studied her face intently. The colonel values the relationship between the military and prominent civilian families. Your father's contributions to territorial defense are significant. Elena felt the conversation's undercurrents shifting like quicksand beneath her feet. Morrison was probing, trying to determine how much she knew about her father's financial support for military operations. And by extension, how much she might know about Henderson's diversion of those funds. Of course, she said. Father believes strongly in supporting our soldiers' efforts to protect settlers from Apache raids. Indeed. And those efforts require careful coordination, precise planning. Sometimes civilian interference, however well-intentioned, can compromise delicate operations. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Elena was being warned to keep silent about anything she might have learned. But the documents in her coat proved that the delicate operations had nothing to do with protecting settlers and everything to do with enriching Henderson and his conspirators. A shout from outside interrupted their verbal chess match. One of Morrison's men had discovered something in the snow near the cabin's rear wall. Elena's heart sank as she recognized the significance. Samuel's carefully concealed escape route, a rope ladder leading down the cliff face that he'd kept for emergencies. The soldiers had found evidence of the cabin's defensive preparations. Morrison's expression shifted from suspicious courtesy to cold calculation. Miss Vasquez, I think we need to have a more direct conversation. Please sit down. Elena backed toward the fireplace, her hand still gripping the hidden revolver. I'm quite comfortable standing, thank you. I wasn't making a request. Morrison's voice carried the snap of military command. My men and I have ridden through dangerous territory in terrible weather to ensure your safety. The least you can do is show proper appreciation for our efforts. The other soldiers had entered the cabin now, their rifles held casually but ready. Elena was outnumbered 5-1, trapped in an isolated mountain cabin during a blizzard, with evidence of high treason hidden in her coat. The situation seemed hopeless. But Samuel's final words echoed in her memory, look in the chest. He'd known this moment might come. Had he prepared for it? Elena glanced toward the wooden chest, now partially obscured by Morrison's position. But her eyes caught something else, a thin wire running along the base of the wall, barely visible in the firelight. It disappeared behind the stone hearth, where Samuel had always kept his emergency supplies. Understanding dawned like sunrise after a long night. Samuel had booby-trapped the cabin. Captain Morrison, Elena said, her voice steadier now, I believe there's something you should know about this cabin before your men search it too thoroughly. Morrison's eyes narrowed. What kind of something? Elena smiled grimly, her finger finding the revolver's trigger. Samuel Morrison wasn't just a deserter. He was an engineer before he enlisted. And engineers, as you know, have very specific skills. Before Morrison could respond, Elena dove toward the fireplace and yanked hard on the nearly invisible wire she'd spotted. The cabin filled with a tremendous roar as Samuel's carefully placed charges detonated simultaneously at 3 points along the structure's foundation. The explosion wasn't meant to kill, Elena realized as debris rained down around them. It was meant to create chaos, confusion, and opportunity for escape. The cabin's front wall collapsed outward, creating a barrier between Elena and Morrison's men while simultaneously opening a clear path to the forest beyond. Elena burst through the smoke and falling timber, the stolen documents secure in her coat and Samuel's revolver clutched in her fist. Behind her, she could hear Morrison screaming orders to his disoriented soldiers, but the combination of the explosion's shock and the blinding snowstorm had given her the precious seconds she needed. She plunged into the white wilderness, her only hope now lying in reaching civilization before Henderson's men could silence her forever. In her coat pocket, the evidence of corruption and treason would either save Samuel's life or get them both killed. But Elena Vasquez was no longer the sheltered rancher's daughter who had ridden up this mountain that morning. She was a woman with a mission, armed with the truth and willing to die to expose it. The storm raged around her as she disappeared into the forest, leaving behind the burning ruins of her old life and the comfortable lies that had defined her world. Whatever happened now, there would be no going back.